What were the working man's meals African Americans ate to survive? These meals powered long days of labor made from scraps, gardens, and grit that kept families strong. Behind every bite, what truths about survival and pride still linger? Slab bacon with cornmeal cakes was one of those meals that showed how far a little bit of meat could go when stretched with bread from the skillet. Families who could not afford thick cuts of pork still managed to find a way to get some smoky flavor into their diet, and bacon scraps from the butcher were usually cheap enough to buy by the handful. Cornmeal cakes themselves were a staple, filling bellies and using ingredients that were easy to store in bulk. Mixing water, cornmeal, and a bit of fat gave you a cake that cooked up golden and crisp on a hot pan. When you laid just a few thin strips of slab bacon across those cakes, the fat soaked in, turning something plain into something satisfying. It may not have been a feast, but it was enough to get a man through a day of heavy work in the fields or in the factory. That kind of energy mattered when strength meant survival. Stewed cowpeas with salt pork was a dish that carried deep roots from African traditions into Southern kitchens, feeding families who needed filling food without paying for expensive meats. Cowpeas were hardy, cheap, and easy to grow, which made them a dependable crop for families that worked the land. When paired with fatty scraps of salt pork, the peas took on a richness that made the whole pot taste far more luxurious than it really was. Housewives would simmer the pot low and slow, letting the flavor of the pork seep into every spoonful. The peas softened, the broth thickened, and what began as humble ingredients turned into a dish that could feed many mouths. It was the kind of food that worked both as supper after the fields and as leftovers for the next day's work lunch. This was survival food in every sense of the word, simple but steady, and always stretching farther than anyone thought possible. Potlikker soup was not something that appeared fancy on a table, but it was a lifeline in kitchens where nothing could go to waste. When greens like collards or turnip tops were boiled down, the dark liquid left in the pot carried vitamins and flavor. That liquid, known as potlikker, was never thrown out. Instead, it was sopped up with pieces of cornbread or saved as broth for later meals. Housewives often seasoned it with onion, a touch of fat, or whatever scraps were on hand, turning it into a meal by itself. After hours in the fields, dipping cornbread into that broth meant warmth, fullness, and strength for the next day. Potlikker carried not just nutrition, but a tradition of making sure even the water used in cooking was valued. In the hands of families who lived on tight margins, it became a symbol of resilience. It proved that survival often came from using every last drop. Fried chitlins were never considered glamorous, but they held an honored place in survival cooking because they used parts of the hog that others ignored. The intestines had to be carefully cleaned and boiled for hours to make them safe and tender enough to eat. Once fried, they developed a crispy outside with a chewy inside, and when seasoned with spices or hot sauce, they became a meal that satisfied in more ways than one. This was not just about taste, but about necessity, because a family could not afford to waste a single part of an animal. Chitlins fed working men who needed protein, and they carried a cultural weight as well, since they connected African American kitchens with traditions carried from Africa. Families would gather to prepare them, turning the labor into a shared ritual. Though humble, fried chitlins reflected dignity, strength, and the will to survive on scraps that others threw away. Pumpkin cornbread was another example of stretching what the land gave into something filling and dependable for the dinner table. Cornmeal was already a backbone of many kitchens, but adding mashed pumpkin gave it more bulk, flavor, and nutrition. Pumpkins grew easily, stored well, and offered sweetness without requiring expensive sugar. Housewives would stir them into the batter, creating cornbread that was moist and hearty. A pan of this cornbread could serve as breakfast with molasses, as supper with beans, or as a midday meal tucked into a worker's pocket. Children filled up on it before heading off to school, and fathers carried slices into the fields. It made the most of what was grown in gardens or shared between neighbors. Though simple, pumpkin cornbread symbolized thrift and ingenuity, reminding everyone that survival came from stretching every crop into something that could fill a belly and keep a family going strong. Salt herring stew was the kind of dish that reflected both poverty and practicality, built from a cheap ingredient that lasted months without spoiling. Salted herring was affordable because it was preserved fish that needed soaking and boiling before eating. Families rehydrated it and cooked it with onions, potatoes, and sometimes a little milk when it was available. What came out of the pot was salty, savory, and strong enough to stand as a main meal. It was not glamorous, but it gave protein and energy to men who worked long days of labor. Housewives could make a single fish stretch across several servings, the broth thickening with potatoes to make it more filling. It carried a sense of the sea even in inland communities, a reminder of trade routes that made cheap protein possible. Salt herring stew was survival food, but it was also comfort for those who ate it, proof that even the harshest flavors could be turned into something sustaining. Blackstrap molasses porridge was a breakfast that fueled both children heading to school and fathers heading to the fields, made from nothing more than cornmeal or oats and thick, dark molasses. Molasses was cheaper than refined sugar and packed with iron, making it both affordable and nutritious. A pot of porridge simmered slowly, with spoonfuls of molasses stirred in to give sweetness and energy. Families relied on it to stretch small amounts of grain into something that filled bowls and stomachs. The sticky sweetness lingered, making children smile even when the rest of the pantry was bare. For housewives, it was a blessing, since it required few ingredients and could be made quickly in the morning. This breakfast carried people through hours of labor, giving strength that bread or meat could not always provide during lean times. It may not sound fancy today, but back then, blackstrap molasses porridge was survival in a bowl. Hog liver pudding was one of the many dishes that used organ meat, because nothing could ever go to waste when feeding a large family on little money. Liver was cheap and often overlooked, but it carried dense nutrition. Housewives would grind it and mix it with cornmeal, onions, and spices before baking it into a savory pudding. The dish sat firm and sliced like bread, meaning it could be served hot at dinner or cold in sandwiches the next day. It stretched a small piece of meat into something that could feed many mouths. The flavor was strong, but seasoning with pepper and herbs helped balance it. For those who grew up on it, hog liver pudding was a reminder of both hardship and care, because it kept families healthy during tough times. It was not about luxury, it was about survival, and housewives made sure it served that purpose well. Cabbage and onions fried in lard was a one-pan dish that brought comfort after long hours of heavy labor. Cabbage was one of the cheapest vegetables available, and onions were easy to grow or trade with neighbors. When cooked together in hot lard, they transformed into something warm, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. Housewives could chop them quickly, fry them in minutes, and have a hot meal ready with little effort. The smell filled kitchens, reminding families that even the humblest foods had power when prepared with care. For working men, this dish meant nourishment at the end of a punishing day. For children, it meant they would go to bed with full stomachs. Though plain, it became a comfort food because it met the need for warmth, nutrition, and ease. Cabbage and onions fried in lard reflected the kind of meals that carried African American families through survival with resourcefulness and strength. Dried apple hand pies were a way to carry both sweetness and energy into the fields or on the road, showing the clever use of preserved fruit. Apples were often dried to last through winter, and housewives folded them into simple dough to make small hand pies. These pies were portable, filling, and could be made in large batches when fruit was available. Sweetened with a little sugar or molasses if possible, they offered a treat that brightened hard days. Workers carried them wrapped in cloth, eating them cold during breaks from labor. Children took them to school as a rare snack. They kept well, meaning nothing went to waste, and families had food ready when hunger struck. Though they seem modest now, dried apple hand pies carried a sense of pride for families who made the most of what little they had. They were survival food with a touch of sweetness, proving that even in struggle, comfort was possible. Pinto beans with cornbread crumble was one of those meals that showed the full value of stretching simple ingredients as far as they would go. Pinto beans softened after hours of simmering, turning into a creamy pot that needed very little to taste rich. Housewives would season them with onion, garlic, or bits of fat when available, then serve them as the centerpiece of supper. Cornbread, already a staple in many households, was crumbled over the top to soak up the juices and add bulk. This meant a single pot of beans could feed not just one person, but an entire family, with everyone getting full. Children grew up eating it regularly, and fathers relied on its strength before going back to long days of labor. Though it was humble food, it had a kind of quiet dignity, proof that with enough patience, a pot of beans could become survival itself. Pinto beans with cornbread crumble carried households through countless lean nights. Sheep tripe stew was not the first choice for most families, but when meat was scarce, nothing could be left unused. Tripe, taken from the lining of a sheep's stomach, was tough and chewy at first, so it required long, slow simmering to make it edible. Housewives learned to stew it with onions, peppers, and spices to create a broth that was both hearty and sustaining. The flavor was strong, but so was the nutrition, and it gave families protein when other cuts were far beyond reach. Eating tripe carried the reminder that survival meant adjusting to ingredients others might ignore. African American families in particular found ways to turn this offal into something filling, working the same skill of resilience they applied to every scrap of food. By the time it reached the table, the tripe had softened into tender pieces floating in rich broth, proof that even the hardest cuts could be transformed with time and care. Sheep tripe stew kept bellies warm and full. Corn fritters with syrup were the kind of dish that brought joy even in the hardest seasons. Cornmeal and kernels were mixed into a batter, fried in hot fat, and turned into golden cakes that crisped on the outside while staying soft within. These fritters could be eaten plain, but a drizzle of sorghum or molasses turned them into something sweet and memorable. Housewives served them as breakfast before a long day of work, or as supper when pantries were nearly bare. Children especially loved them because even the smallest taste of sweetness made ordinary meals feel special. Corn was cheap and plentiful, which meant fritters could be made often without straining a family's budget. They were filling, portable, and easy to cook in large batches, making them a dependable meal for both workdays and school days. In kitchens where survival was the daily goal, corn fritters with syrup proved that comfort and sustenance could still walk hand in hand. Smothered cabbage with sausage ends reflected the practice of never letting a single scrap of meat go to waste. Cabbage was affordable, plentiful, and versatile, often filling the table multiple nights each week. When sausage was cooked, the ends and scraps left behind would be saved and added to cabbage as it simmered down in a pot. The fat and flavor from those bits transformed the humble vegetable into something hearty enough to stand as a full meal. Housewives used this trick to stretch one link of sausage into dinner for an entire household. Families looked forward to it because it combined the freshness of cabbage with the savoriness of meat without requiring much money at all. It became a favorite for cold nights when a hot pan on the stove made the whole house smell warm. Smothered cabbage with sausage ends showed that thrift and flavor could come together, creating a dish that was both practical and deeply satisfying. Rice porridge with cinnamon was the kind of dish that crossed many generations, both simple and comforting. Rice was boiled in water or milk until it became thick and creamy, then sweetened with sugar, honey, or molasses if the pantry allowed. A sprinkle of cinnamon transformed it into something that felt far richer than it really was. Families often served this dish in the morning to give children a warm start before school or late at night when nothing else was on hand. It was filling without being costly, and it could be made in large amounts with little effort. The smell of cinnamon wafting from the pot gave a sense of comfort even when cupboards were nearly bare. For working men, it meant starting the day with energy. For housewives, it meant stretching ingredients to feed everyone at once. Rice porridge with cinnamon carried the weight of necessity, but also the taste of care and comfort. Fried cow tongue slices were a survival dish that turned an overlooked cut into something surprisingly hearty. The tongue had to be boiled first, cooked for hours until tender enough to slice. Once cooled, it could be cut into pieces and fried in hot fat, creating a crisp outside and a chewy, flavorful center. When seasoned with salt, pepper, or onions, it carried the feel of steak even if it was far cheaper. Families who could not afford prime cuts of beef learned to rely on tongue as their substitute, and housewives made it stretch as far as possible. Served with bread or potatoes, it became a filling meal that carried men through long shifts of labor. Children might not have loved it at first, but hunger made every plate valuable. Fried cow tongue slices reflected both resourcefulness and the willingness to make do. They proved that survival often came from finding strength in the pieces others ignored. Molasses-glazed sweet potatoes were an affordable way to turn a simple root vegetable into something hearty and comforting. Sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil, and families leaned on them heavily when other crops failed. Peeled and sliced, they were baked or boiled, then drizzled with molasses that caramelized into a sticky glaze. This combination gave a balance of sweetness and substance, perfect for filling stomachs after long hours of work. Children loved the sugary taste, while adults appreciated that it kept everyone satisfied without requiring expensive ingredients. Housewives knew sweet potatoes could feed an entire household with very little cost, making them one of the most dependable staples available. Even when pantries were bare, a dish of molasses-glazed sweet potatoes made the table feel full. They brought not only nourishment, but also a small measure of comfort, proof that survival food could carry a sweetness of its own. It was a dish born of thrift, but remembered with fondness. Pokeweed omelet came from foraging traditions, when families turned to the land itself to make meals stretch. Pokeweed grew wild in the south and was gathered in the spring when the young shoots were tender. Though poisonous when mature, the greens were safe to eat once boiled and cooked properly. Housewives often chopped them and scrambled them with eggs to create an omelet that was both nutritious and filling. It carried the fresh taste of the season, and for families who struggled, it was one more way of turning the earth into food. Men carried the strength from such meals into their workdays, while children learned the value of foraging from their parents. It was a survival practice that tied people directly to the land and its cycles. Pokeweed omelet was not glamorous, but it kept households fed, showing that ingenuity often meant looking right outside the door for the next meal. Salt pork and turnip stew was a dish that warmed bellies in the coldest months when vegetables were scarce. Salt pork scraps provided the fat and flavor, while turnips gave bulk and nutrition. Stewed together, they created a broth that was hearty, savory, and filling. This was the kind of dish that simmered all day on the back of the stove, stretching scraps into a pot large enough for a whole family. Families gathered around the table with bowls of steaming stew, eating slowly to make it last. For men who worked outside in harsh weather, it provided both warmth and strength. Housewives relied on it because turnips were hearty and cheap, and salt pork could be stored for long periods. Though plain, it was the type of meal that left no one hungry and no scrap wasted. Salt pork and turnip stew stood as proof that simple combinations could carry households through hard winters. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were the kind of food that showed ingenuity at its finest, transforming water and meal into something sustaining. Cornmeal was mixed with a little fat, sometimes egg, and shaped into balls that were dropped into a simmering broth. As they cooked, the dumplings swelled, soaking up flavor and thickening the liquid around them. A plain pot of broth suddenly became a filling supper that could stretch to feed many mouths. Housewives leaned on this dish because it required so little yet gave so much, offering comfort at the end of a hard day. Families ate it together, sopping up the last drops with bread if any was available. Though it seems modest, cornmeal dumplings in broth carried deep meaning for households living on survival margins. It was not just food, it was a way of making sure no one went to bed hungry. That memory alone gave it lasting significance long after the lean years passed. Wild berry cobblers were the kind of dessert that came straight from the land, born out of the need to make something sweet when money was short and pantries were bare. Families would gather berries from hedges, woods, or fence rows, collecting blackberries, dewberries, or whatever nature offered. Housewives would toss those berries with a bit of sugar or molasses if they had it, then cover the fruit with scraps of biscuit dough or leftover pastry before sliding it into the oven. The smell that filled the kitchen was enough to lift spirits because sweetness was not something people could take for granted. Cobbler made sure no berry went to waste, even the ones too bruised to eat raw. For children, it was often the closest they came to a treat, and for fathers home from long days of work, it felt like something special after simple suppers of beans or greens. It was humble, but it carried a kind of joy because it reminded everyone that survival did not have to mean giving up on comfort. Wild berry cobblers proved that thrift and delight could share the same plate when hands, gardens, and patience came together. Stewed cucumber with onions may sound unusual to modern ears, but it was a resourceful way to keep food from spoiling and make use of what gardens produced in excess. Cucumbers were plentiful in summer, and rather than let them rot, housewives simmered them gently with sliced onions in a pan of fat or broth. Seasoned with pepper, salt, or vinegar when available, the dish carried a tang that broke the monotony of other staples. Children who had eaten raw cucumbers for weeks on end welcomed the change, and fathers who came home weary from work found comfort in the warm, savory flavor. Stewed cucumber was not glamorous, but it represented the ingenuity of stretching the garden harvest as far as it would go. Every bite told the story of avoiding waste and turning the simplest crops into something hearty enough to sit proudly on the dinner table. For many families, it was proof that creativity in the kitchen was as essential as anything grown in the field. Okra fritters were a dish that made the most out of one of the most dependable crops in the South. Okra grew well even in tough soil, and when battered and fried, it became a filler that satisfied whole families on very little. Housewives would slice the pods, dip them into a batter of cornmeal and water, and fry them until they turned golden and crisp. These patties could be eaten as the main dish when meat was scarce, or served as sides to beans and greens. The sticky texture of okra worked to bind the fritters together, making them both cheap and practical. A drizzle of molasses or sorghum turned them into a sweet treat for children, while hot peppers added heat for adults craving stronger flavor. Okra fritters were easy to cook in large batches, which made them perfect for feeding many mouths at once. They were also portable enough to be carried into fields or packed into school lunches. Simple, filling, and adaptable, they reflected the resilience of African American kitchens where waste was unthinkable. Okra fritters carried strength, comfort, and cultural pride, proving that survival food could still taste rich and satisfying. Salted cod with potatoes was a dish that carried echoes of old trade routes, where dried fish became an affordable protein source for struggling households. Imported salt fish was cheap, preserved, and easy to store for months, which made it especially valuable in homes that could not count on steady supplies of meat. To prepare it, families soaked the fish in water to draw out some of the salt, then boiled or stewed it with potatoes and onions. The flavor was strong, but when blended with soft potatoes, it became hearty and nourishing. Housewives relied on this dish to stretch one piece of fish into enough portions to feed everyone at the table. It was also a way to make sure no one went hungry during times when fresh meat was reserved for wealthier families. Salted cod with potatoes represented survival, sacrifice, and connection to a broader history of frugal cooking. It carried the memory of endurance, feeding workers who needed strength and families who made do with whatever the market stalls or pantries offered. A simple pot could mean the difference between hunger and comfort. Wild greens with peanut dressing reflected the practice of turning what the fields and woods offered into dependable meals. Families would forage for dandelion greens, pokeweed, mustard leaves, or whatever plants were in season, knowing these were free sources of nutrition. To give the dish body and flavor, ground peanuts were mixed with water, salt, and spices into a thick sauce that was poured over the greens. The dressing added protein and richness to what might otherwise feel too plain or bitter. Families valued it not just for the taste, but for the way it stretched scarce ingredients into full meals. For children, it was a lesson in resourcefulness, learning how to gather food from nature and turn it into something sustaining. For adults, it was a reminder that survival required both knowledge of the land and skill in the kitchen. Wild greens with peanut dressing showed how deeply traditions from Africa remained alive in African American households. It was a dish that tied culture, necessity, and resilience together into one humble plate. Hominy and collard soup was a dish that showed the strength of pairing simple corn with dark leafy greens. Hominy, made by soaking dried corn kernels, was cheap and filling, while collard greens added both flavor and nutrition. Housewives simmered them together in large pots, often with a scrap of pork or fatback to deepen the broth. The result was a hearty soup that filled bowls and bellies alike. Children dipped cornbread into it, while fathers carried the energy it provided back into the fields. It was inexpensive to prepare, yet packed enough sustenance to stretch over several meals. In communities where gardens thrived, collards were easy to grow and harvest, ensuring that no family went without something green on the table. Hominy and collard soup was more than food. It was a survival strategy, a way to keep families fed during harsh winters or times of scarcity. It carried history, heritage, and strength in every spoonful. To those who lived on it, it was not just soup, but a lifeline that kept households steady through uncertain times. Chicken feet broth reflected the tradition of using every possible part of an animal, leaving nothing wasted. While wealthier families discarded the feet, African American households boiled them slowly into a broth that became thick, gelatinous, and rich with flavor. Spices, onions, and rice were added to stretch it further, creating a meal that could feed many mouths. The broth carried high nutrition, delivering strength to workers and comfort to children. It was not fancy, but it was dependable, and it turned scraps into something that felt hearty and sustaining. Housewives took pride in making even the most overlooked pieces into meals that mattered. The gelatinous broth could be poured over rice, sipped on its own, or used as the base for stews that lasted several days. Chicken feet broth carried a quiet dignity, proof that survival was not about luxury, but about ingenuity and care. It tied households to traditions of thrift, respect for food, and resilience that shaped entire communities. Scuppernong grape jelly with biscuits brought a touch of sweetness to tables that often knew little of it. Scuppernongs, a type of muscadine grape found across the South, could be foraged in late summer and turned into preserves. Housewives boiled the grapes with sugar, strained the juice, and cooked it into jelly that could last through the year. Spread over hot biscuits, it became a rare treat for children and a comfort for adults. The sweetness was more than flavor. It was a reminder that survival did not mean giving up on pleasure. Families shared it proudly, knowing that the jelly came from their own labor in the fields and woods. It made mornings brighter and lifted spirits in times when money was scarce. Scuppernong grape jelly with biscuits was more than food. It was memory, culture, and comfort, passed down through hands that turned wild harvests into something lasting. It held the taste of resilience and the promise of better days. Fried cornmeal mush was a way of making sure no scrap of food went to waste, turning yesterday's breakfast into today's supper. Cornmeal mush, a thick porridge, was poured into pans to cool and firm overnight. In the morning, slices of the solid mush were cut and fried in hot fat until crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. Housewives served it with syrup, molasses, or even gravy, depending on what was available. This meant that one simple pot of cornmeal could stretch into multiple meals, feeding families again and again. Children loved it with sweetness, while fathers appreciated its filling strength before long days of labor. It carried no glamour, but it carried warmth and energy. Fried cornmeal mush proved that with patience and care, even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something new. It reflected thrift, tradition, and the enduring creativity of households that knew how to survive. Homemade sorghum candy pulls were a rare indulgence for children in families that lived mostly on survival food. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than refined sugar, was boiled until thick and sticky, then stretched and pulled by hand into chewy strands. Housewives made it in small batches, often gathering children to help twist the cooling candy. The treat was simple, but it carried excitement, because it broke the monotony of plain meals and offered sweetness that could last for days. Candy pulls became community events too, with neighbors sharing syrup and stories while children laughed over sticky fingers. For households with little money, sorghum candy was proof that joy could still be found in small moments. It tied families together, gave children something to remember, and turned survival into celebration. Homemade sorghum candy pulls were never about luxury. They were about finding sweetness in the hardest of times. They showed that thrift and delight could share the same pan. Which of these survival meals would you dare to try? Drop it in the comments, smash that like button, and subscribe for more food stories that bite back.